Hey everyone, this is Chappie Feeney, the Product Marketing Manager here at Intense, and for today's video we're going to be going over how to remove the rear shock from your M29 and change out the spring. Let's get started. Alright, so first step, we're going to get the chain in the smallest gear of the cassette, lock the derailleur in the forward position, and remove our rear axle. Drop our wheel out. Next, to give us a little more access, we'll remove our rear fender. Next, we're going to take a 6mm Allen and loosen and remove the front shock bolt. Gently let the rear triangle fall back. And this will expose the lower shock bolt. Next step, we're going to remove the lower shock bolt, which will require a 15mm plate wrench or a 15mm box wrench, which can be accessed from the front side. And then we'll use a 6mm Allen to loosen and remove the shock bolt. The shock nut will actually retain itself into position if you just push it back into the bearing as so. Next, we'll just pull up gently and remove the shock out of the front triangle. Now let's go over to the bench. All right, so next step here, so we're going to roll the shock up. We're going to remove our rebound knob. This will use a 2mm Allen. Just take care to keep the small screw and that it doesn't fall and get lost. Next, we're going to remove the lower shock hardware. You can use a small little 8mm 1/4" driver or a drift or a hardware removal tool for this that should slide out by hand. A little bit of pressure. Next step is we're going to loosen the retaining screws for our preload collar. These only need to go about half a turn in each one. And from there, we can release the preload on the coil. Once we get about to that point, we can go ahead and remove our circlip here. Either do it by hand. Just get one side started, one edge, and then just slowly roll it around and it should pop right off. From there, we can remove the lower spring retainer. Set that aside and slide our coil off. All right, and then to reassemble, you take the spring of choice, whether you have a lower spring rate or a higher spring rate to accommodate your sag measurement. We'll go ahead and slide the spring back over. We'll slide our lower spring retainer on. Then we'll go ahead and reinstall our circlip. Just again, start by one side and roll it around the edge. You kind of want it, it'll just snap into place. Once you hear that snap, you know that circlip is positioned. You can give it a little twist to make sure everything's aligned. And we'll line up our lower spring retainer there. Turn the shock upright and wind down our coil preload. Now from this point, we just want to set it to snug and then go 1.5 turns, which is our minimum amount of preload. So you can use these adjusters as kind of your eyeball. So there's one turn. 1.5 turns. So this is now set up. Next step here is we're going to reinstall our rebound knob. So our rebound knob, drop our small screw into the knob itself. And get this tightened down. The torque value for this rebound knob is 1.5 Newton meters, so a very small amount. Once that's on, we'll prep our hardware here. Reinstall. So what I like to do is just slide one side on with the O-ring, get it into position, and then you can just simply push it till it's flush. Make sure your other small O-ring is in place, and then slide the other hardware on. Now from that point, shock is reassembled and ready to go back into the bike. So with the DVO shock, we already have our lower hardware removed. We'll go ahead and release our spring preload. just simply by loosening our preload collar up here at the top. This one, we'll want to take the collar all the way up to the top of the body of the shock. Then we can slide down our spring isolator here at the top. And then from that point, we can take our lower retainer plate and basically just line it up with the groove and slide it out. And we can slide off our isolator and our spring. Now from that point to reassemble, we'll just reverse that order of operation, slide our spring of choice into place, install our spring isolator, and then slide in our lower spring retainer. Once that's in place, flip the shock back over, make sure everything's lined up, and then from there we can tighten down our spring preload. Now if we're working on getting sag set up, we'll just go to 0 amount of preload, 0 turns of preload there, and then we'll just start at our minimum, which is 1.5. So we can use the logo here as our check. So 1, 1.5. Now this shock would be ready to install onto your bike. Cool. So back at the bike, we're going to take our reassembled shock here and carefully guide it into the tunnel. Catch the back side of the shock, line it up with the lower link, and then just as a measure, we'll go ahead and put our finger on that small shock bolt, and we'll use that to help us align the shock. Push it down into position. Now we'll take our shock bolt coming in from the non-drive side. Before we slide it all the way through, we're going to go ahead and put our finger back on the shock nut, press that into place, and come back with our 6mm Allen. Go ahead, get that spun down. Next is we want to make sure that the front of the shock is lined up between the shock mount area. We're going to set it down into the bottom, and we're going to come back and torque the lower shock bolt. Okay. Using our 15mm plate wrench and a 6mm Allen, we're going to torque this to 16 Newton meters. Next, we're going to go ahead and pull the front of the shock up. In protecting the frame here with our hand, we're going to roll the rear triangle back into the forward position. Once the rear triangle is in that forward position, we're going to come back with our front shock bolt. We can use our hand to hold the shock and the rear triangle at the same time and roll the rear triangle forward as we align the shock. Slide that into place. We'll go ahead and tighten this front shock bolt down and torque to 16 Newton meters. Next step, we're going to slide our rear fender up and into position. Now these are slotted, so you can move them up or down. I prefer them in the up position. We'll tighten and torque to 3 Newton meters. Last step, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our rear wheel. So lining the chain up on the small screw of the cassette, slide the wheel up, slide our axle in, come back with our 5mm. Good. All right, so there you have it. We have successfully completed our shock removal and spring replacement video. If you need any other assistance or need any help deciding which spring rate is best for you, we have a spring chart located in your user manual, or just feel free to call in the customer service team, and we'll be more than happy to help get you dialed in. Thanks for choosing Intense.